Hi, everybody. Good to have people joining us today for this fabulous session around facilitating hybrid classrooms and remote learning. I'll give people the chance to come into the session. I'll give it a few minutes before we get going, but really excited for you guys to join us today. We do have, and I'll go over this again before the session actually starts, but you'll notice that there's a Q&A section, so you can be adding questions to that as the session rolls on. And also, please feel free to use the chat. We'd love to hear where you're from, what school district you're from, and maybe what your role is at your school or district. So people are piling in. We'll let them keep coming in for a couple minutes. And again, feel free to use that chat. Say who you are, where you're from. We'd love to learn about the kinds of people who are attending these sessions, and any questions that you have, use that Q&A, and if possible, we'll get to the questions during the session. If not, there will be some time at the end for you to, for some answers to your questions. All right, well, it's a couple minutes after, so I think we'll get going in the interest of time. So I'm Lindsay Kane. I'm the Director of Channel Sales. Really excited to have you all here for another session in Tech's Virtual Summit. Today, we'll be talking about facilitating hybrid classrooms and remote learning. And we have our awesome partners here from CDW. Really excited to introduce you all. So we have Mike Peters joining us, Santino Martinez, Maureen Corlett, and Cale LaSalata. And again, we'll be talking about facilitating hybrid classrooms and remote learning. Please feel free to ask any questions, use that Q&A, and also use the chat feature as well. Thanks so much, and I'll turn it over to Maureen.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now for everyone. So again, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks, Lindsay, for inviting us. My name again is Maureen Corlett, and I'm a Learning Environment Advisor here at CDW. And basically what that means is we have a team of folks that are here to help school districts find the best technology for their teaching and learning goals. And obviously over the last several months, what teaching and learning looks like and how it's facilitated has changed pretty dramatically. So we've spent this time really researching the best technologies and what schools might potentially look like for the fall, and we've put together our vision of the hybrid classroom and remote learning. So as you mentioned earlier, it's not just myself on this team, but this is our entire team of Learning Environment Advisors. So again, Maureen Corlett, I work with districts in New York and on the West. Santino Martinez works with the middle part of the country, and Cale LaSalata works with the East. In addition to the three of us, Nick Young is not able to join us today, but he is our field solution architect for audiovisual. And but we do have Mike Peters. He is our team lead for classroom transformation. And so in all of this, our team really wanted to take the approach of doing all of the research, so that way again we could make sure that we were making the best recommendations for school districts. There's really hybrid learning, remote learning, flipped classrooms. All of this stuff isn't new, but it's not widely done. Like we saw, school districts having to drop everything and do remote learning on the drop of a hat. So there's no blueprint for schools, and we wanted to do, the research around it and understand the whole landscape in making our recommendations for technology. So one of the first things we looked at were CDC guidelines, and this is really a brief overview. It's obviously not everything in the CDC guidelines, but we wanted to zero in on things that related to space. I also should add, as I think everyone on the call probably knows, is that things are constantly changing. I do expect, or at least what we're hearing, is that there will be updates to the CDC guidelines by the end of the month, but these are what they are as of right now. And the CDC breaks it down into basically 3 different groups. So maintaining healthy environments, maintaining healthy operations, and promoting behaviors that reduce the spread. So when we're looking at healthy environments, these are the main things that they recommend, which is discouraging the use or disinfecting in between use of any types of shared objects. Layouts of the classroom should be modified. Students 6 feet apart where possible and facing front. There's been a lot of collaborative type learning going on. However, the recommendation really is to have students face forward. Where that's not possible, you should implement physical barriers and guides. So plastic plexiglass in between areas where you can't maintain 6 feet of social distancing, and also guides on the floor to help students and teachers and staff understand, where the 6 feet is. And lastly, closing communal spaces where possible. This includes gyms, playgrounds, cafeterias. Certainly, they understand that you can't close a cafeteria entirely, but how do you come up with creative solutions to get students their meals without physically, gathering, hundreds of students in one space? That could be box lunches, or it could be having lunches delivered to the classroom. Next, we have maintaining healthy operations. So gatherings and visitors should be done virtually wherever possible, and if it can't be, to be done socially distant. The second one here is one that I think we're hearing about a lot across the country, and that's cohorting. So keeping groups of students together throughout the day. This allows the containment if there's any infection, and also the tracing of those infections as well. So cohorting is really super important in the overall picture. And lastly, they recommend staggering scheduling. So instead of, again, having hundreds of students showing up at a school all at the same time, staggering their arrivals allows, preventing those large groups of students all in one place. And then lastly, we have promoting behaviors that reduce the spread. So first and foremost, everyone should know when they should stay home as far as, temperatures, not feeling well. Staff, students need to know that they need to stay home under those circumstances. So lastly, we've been reminding students again since the spring, and all of us, to wash our hands, cloth face coverings, also, again, big recommendation. And then lastly, the more we can sort of remind people visually, so that's with signs and messaging of like, these are the behaviors and the expectations, the easier it is for students and staff to sort of follow it. So visible signs in busy areas of the school, or more prominent areas of the school. But in addition to that, messaging, which could be social media, it could be videos, and it also could be emails to get that information of the expectations out to the school. The other thing we wanted to point out as a team, we focus on classroom transformation, but we realize that there's a lot more that goes into this whole puzzle of coming up with a plan for what fall is going to look like. So we just wanted to put a lot of these other things here. These are things that CDW can talk about and help you with, not necessarily my team, but we're happy to point you in the right direction for guidance around some of these other items. So in addition to the learning environment advisors, we have a group of education strategists, and they're equipped to have conversations around equity or social emotional learning. We also have a group of physical security team that could talk to you about temperature checks. So basically anything that might kind of come to mind as you're putting this plan together. We're the classroom transformation team, but we have folks that can take a deeper dive on these. If you reach out to us, we can get you in contact with the right people. And we're also lucky enough here in the United States that we're able to kind of use our crystal ball and look ahead to see what other school districts across the world have done with their reopenings. So there's all these great images that we've pulled together for you to just sort of like visualize what that's going to look like. And they've kind of been the guinea pigs, and we can sort of learn from all of that information. So over here you have Denmark, very socially distanced elementary school students, but you also can see on their desktops, they have their own individual little tubs, so they're not sharing pencils and papers in between students. They have their own individual items, so they're not, again, sharing. In the center here in Hong Kong, we see it looks like this might be a cafeteria or a gym, which they're utilizing a large space, which makes it easier to socially distance a large group of students. And then we also have another photo from Denmark, which shows the socially distanced student drop-off. Just a couple more, and there's so many more in addition to these, but we have France, which they have the take guides on the floor, so that directs the flow of traffic in a classroom. So again, students aren't getting bunched up. With older students, again, in the center, we have France, arrival to school, getting their temperature checks, making sure that they're wearing their mask before they come into school, and entering individually versus massive groups. And then last, we have a photo from China, which it's not so apparent that they're following a lot of the socially distancing guidelines, but they do. You'll see that every student has a mask, and they all have the plexiglass on each individual student desk. And so from there, what we've been talking to school districts around the country, and what we've been researching in the news articles, our team is glued to see what different areas of the country are announcing. And so we've sort of distilled those reopening scenarios into basically 3 different buckets. I know there are 5 here, but the 3 in the middle are really all that hybrid model. So first and foremost, there is full on-site. And according to the CDC, this carries the highest risk. And what this basically is all of your students go back to school, implementing some additional safety guidance around, wearing masks, hand washing, temperature checks, but basically having all of your students come back. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have full remote. So this is pretty much doing what most school districts were doing this past spring, fully remote with the students, taking everything we learned from that the summer to figure out how to do remote learning even better, and continuing to do full remote into the fall. Most recently, we've seen several districts, particularly in California, announcing that they were going to be using this particular model. But basically, everything else in between is kind of encapsulated into this hybrid model. So first of all, school districts are adjusting their calendars. So they might do an earlier start date or a later start date. Some schools prefer to get their students do as much in-person learning as they possibly can before the eventual possibility of spikes. Some school districts have opted to start a little bit later because they're just simply not prepared. All of these, in that previous slide with the PPEs and the temperature checks, they're just simply not prepared, and they prefer to start a little bit later, being more prepared. But schools might need to add dates for closures that might happen. They might also look at a full calendar year. But more specifically, when we're sort of prioritizing students on campus versus students going remote, there's a couple different things that we're seeing schools do, which is first and foremost, and this is another CDC recommendation, is giving students the option to go remote versus having to come in person. And so that alleviates some of that, that helps de-densify the classrooms first and foremost by students opting not to come and getting their instruction remotely. Schools also might take the approach of prioritizing the types of classes that are done on site versus remote. So things that are hands-on, whether it be a CTE class or a science lab, having those courses being done on site versus, English or a social studies class, which could be done more remotely. And lastly, again, in an effort to sort of prioritize and de-densify, having high school students go fully remote because they're sort of the most capable of doing it entirely remote, and moving the elementary and the middle school students to different buildings again. So some of the elementary could move to the middle school and some of the middle school could move into the high school. Lastly, under this whole umbrella of, hybrid learning is the adjusted and flexible schedule. And this, there's so many different possibilities and iterations of what this might look like, but schools might alternate days between students being on site and remote. This could be done weekly. It also could be done within the same day, first half and second half. We're also seeing some teachers rotating instead of the students moving from class to class. And so in putting all of that together, what we've looked at is the CDC. We're looking at what schools around the globe are doing, and then we're also looking at different plans that have been announced or discussions that we've had with districts, and we've put all of this together. And I think it's really helpful to be able to visualize this, because this is nothing that we've sort of ever seen before in mass and at scale within school districts. So what our team wanted to put together is sort of a visualization of what that hybrid classroom is going to look like, and then what the technology is going to look like. So I'm actually going to kick this over to my colleague Cale to walk us through what the classroom is going to look like.
Thank you, Maureen. So as probably everybody that's on this call has experienced, throughout their lifetimes, and probably what you're doing right now up until March, that teaching has traditionally centered in a classroom where the student and the instructor are both present within the same space, which grants all the students ample visibility to the instructor and to the concepts that are being taught, which facilitates a natural dialogue as well as a spontaneous type of collaboration between students. So as everybody's very much aware, recent events have upended this traditional class model. So new approaches have to be considered for the fall semester and obviously beyond. So as schools determine the best way forward, they're going to have to establish the best way, the most optimal way to keep students and faculty protected while also meeting their instructional objectives, whether the students are in class or they're learning remotely. So one approach that schools have been considering is a form of blended learning in which students alternate between an on-premise and a distance learning approach. One strong advantage to this particular model is that schools can ensure proper social distancing is maintained for those within the classroom, while also furthering the collaborative learning through inclusive conferencing solutions. So more than likely, schools already have their preferred conferencing platforms in place. So think here Zoom, WebEx, Teams, Hangouts. If not, this is the first step. The next step would be to add an external camera, and Santino is going to get into some of the options that we're recommending, as well as a large format display to connect those students who are remote that day and bring them into the classroom virtually. Finally, in this model, a team approach to instruction is taken. So the class would be divided into two teams. For our model here, we have our class divided into red and blue teams, each with assigned days to be in the classroom and assigned days to be remote. And schools can also add another layer of precaution and protection for their students on premise by including clear partitions or mobile room dividers, which can help block that accidental transmission of the virus through speaking, coughing, sneezing, things that students just do, day to day. So here you can really get a sense of a hybrid classroom in this slide as it sort of showcases the full remote solution. You have the teacher who's presenting as they normally would, but obviously to an empty classroom. Students would be present via whichever platform the teacher or the district is most comfortable with. Again, Zoom, WebEx, Teams, Hangouts, and attending class remotely. So capturing the teacher's instruction would be the external camera. So combined, these elements create a very unique hybrid learning environment. And to enable the remote portion of the coursework, we've pulled together some camera options to accommodate your instructional needs, which, as I now kick it over to Santino, he's will go through the camera differentiation.
Thank you, Cale. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a little time, and we're first going to differentiate the different kinds of cameras that are available to educators such as yourselves, especially for this situation. So we're breaking it up on this slide into 3 different buckets. All right. So the first one is the standard webcam. And so what the standard webcam is, it would be a device that you would use, and I'm sure all of you know this, but it would be something that's going to replace the lower quality camera that you would have either in a teacher laptop, or if your teachers have desktops, then obviously they would need some sort of external webcam. And it allows for, number one, a higher resolution. So at minimum, you're going to get HD quality. But a lot of the newer webcams that we're seeing are supporting a higher 4K resolution. So in addition to these cameras, you can actually use them. We've seen a lot of schools use them and be a little creative with them and use them as like a temporary document camera, basically positioned to showcase whatever the instructor wanted to show or highlight as they're teaching. We've seen these cameras obviously take a huge bump in terms of a lot of schools deployed them for their remote learning solutions when, early part of this year or the first 2 quarters of this year. So this is the one approach, and these are one of the types of cameras that you have available to you. One caveat here is that because a lot of schools went this route, they are also the hardest to get a hold of, with a lot of constraint in terms of inventory, or a lot of them being back ordered well into the later part of the year. Another option that's available to you in terms of camera types is a streaming type of camera. So this would be a camera that is designed to support a direct to streaming to a platform such as Twitch, if any of you are familiar with esports, or YouTube Live, Facebook Live, etc. So what we've seen is a lot of these cameras get deployed, especially towards the later part of last school year, when schools were looking to live stream student graduations or any kinds of events. We're also starting to see a lot of schools take interest in these types of cameras for sporting events to basically live stream, so that with the CDC guidelines that Maureen had covered earlier, it's going to be very difficult to have some sort of audience participation or any kind of people watching an actual football game. So one solution is to go the route of a live streaming camera. And then lastly on the right, what we have is a PTZ camera. What PTZ stands for is pan, tilt, and zoom. These are a super popular option right now. What it does is it enables a much wider field of vision, view when it comes to recording an entire classroom. You're going to have the capability to tilt, which means to move up and down, to pan, which means to move from side to side, and to zoom. Oftentimes you have the capability of zooming 10 times zoom. I've seen some cameras go to a 16 times optical zoom. So what this does is this gives you the flexibility of positioning this camera in the classroom. You can mount it on the ceiling upside down, like the way the slide previously that Cale showed you. You can move it towards the front of the classroom. You can move it towards the back of the classroom if you wanted to get some of your students who are also on premise in the same video feed. And you can actually have the capability to zoom closer if there's anything that your instructor or your teacher wanted to highlight that a student who was attending on premise would normally get. So many of these PTZ cameras can be connected via USB for easy setup and can be paired with an external or additional microphones to ensure proper audio coverage in the classroom or the learning space. So moving on, what we're going to do now is break down 4 different kinds of strategies, and these are most of the strategies that we're seeing being the most popular amongst K-12 school districts across the country. So the first strategy is deploying some sort of all-in-one camera. Basically what this is it has a camera that has an integrated speakerphone into it. It's more ideal for a smaller space, such as a conference room or huddle room, where it was typically being deployed, and they have it can be adjusted. You can pick it up. They're mobile, so they're a lot more flexible. So in terms of a smaller space, or if you have the need to have your camera easily be picked up and moved around, you can go with this first strategy. The second strategy that we have wanted to highlight is actually using a single PTZ camera. So again, a PTZ camera is able to capture a much larger room, Typically, this camera can be installed again on the ceiling or in the back of the room, like I mentioned earlier. It can be pointed towards the instructor, or it can be pointed towards the front of the classroom. If you wanted to get those remote students to have feel a little bit more apart or have some sense of normalcy, where those students can actually see their fellow classmates as they're attending remotely, you can point it that way. You can daisy chain multiple microphones or speakerphones with this PTZ camera, since it is USB based, to combined with like a tabletop type of microphone, so that not only are your students who are attending remotely able to hear the teacher and everything that's being taught, but those students who are attending remotely can also hear those students, those fellow students who are on premise, and any comments that they may have or any questions that they may have, and feel a little bit more as if they're a part of that classroom and everything that is being taught. Strategy 3 is very similar to strategy 2. And what we're doing is basically taking a single PTZ camera and doubling it, so you have a multi-camera setup. This is more kind of specialized, a little bit more niche. Usually it's ideal for much larger rooms, especially for like lecture halls, or in the case if you have a teacher who is going to be a biology teacher and they're going to be dissecting a frog, you can have one camera pointed at the teacher, but then you can have the other camera pointed on whatever they wanted to highlight. Obviously, since this is a little bit more specialized, it's something that's going to require more hardware. It's typically going to be a little bit more expensive. So it's something that, again, more niche, more specialized, but you can deploy this. It's going to have all the benefits of the single camera PTZ option, where you can mount it on the ceiling. You can have multiple mounting choices, or you can just have them on top of a cart, and it's going to give you a lot more flexibility that way. The final strategy that I'm going to cover is the cart-based one. And so this one is quickly becoming a popular choice for hybrid learning environments. In this scenario, we have a camera that's mounted with a large format display, which can be interactive, or you can have a non-interactive option, such as like a large format, basically a commercially rated TV. You're going to have it on the cart, and this is one that we see schools typically go the route of if, number one, they want something that's a lot more mobile and flexible. If you don't have the budget to put a camera into every classroom, and you know that you're going to have teachers who are going to need it at specific times, you can go the route of going the cart-based model and then wheeling it to class as needed. Another reason why this is super popular and a lot of schools are considering it is because if you're concerned about privacy and you don't want other students to see maybe a student's home, if you're not using Zoom, if you're not using something that blurs the background out, and you just wanted to focus on those students and engaging how well a student is grasping or comprehending whatever lesson is being taught, you can have that a little bit closer to the professor, so that professor can have that one-to-one kind of face interaction that they would normally have in the classroom. So these are like kind of the 4 strategies that we have. What I want to do is I'm actually going to pass it over to Mike Peters, and he's going to go into some of the audio considerations that that you should take into consideration. So Mike, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thanks, Santino. So as Maureen was talking about earlier, there are a number of CDC guidelines that we're watching and closely considering as far as that return to the classroom space, whether we're remote or hybrid or some combination throughout the school year. And one of the things that we've really been examining as a team and understanding is that the audio of the solution that goes towards the remote or hybrid experience is as important as the video is as well. And so what we've got highlighted here are a few different scenarios around audio solutions that you can pair with those webcams as well as integrate in with your video conferencing solutions. So it sounds like maybe we're having some audio. I don't know if everybody.
Yeah, Mike, you're a little bit choppy right now. It's a little bit of distortion.
Okay, do you want to run with this if your audio seems to be a little bit better than mine then?
Absolutely, I can run with it. All right, so what we have and what Mike was going to get into is the different options that we have available for audio for you in terms of an educator. And actually, Mike was going to get into some super valuable information when it comes to this because, number one, I'm sure as educators you have already been exploring cameras or webcam options, and it's starting to seem like, everyone's doing the exact same thing, so there's a little bit of constraint. If you have one option to go for in terms of going a full remote, if you're going, like Maureen had mentioned earlier, if you're going full remote, or if you're going to have that hybrid approach, I would suggest, and we would suggest actually, that you start really taking into consideration the audio portion. The audio portion is kind of similar to what we're doing now. We can still have a Zoom meeting. If I didn't have a camera plugged in, you can still hear my voice and I can still share my slides. So there's still a way that you can teach students who are attending remotely via audio and ensuring that those students are hearing whatever that teacher is teaching clearly and understanding everything, and everything is coming across very well and very crisp, as we just learned. So when it comes to the audio options that you have available to you, there's a few different routes that you can go if you're just looking for audio for a remote type of environment. The first one on the left is an omnidirectional microphone. Typically what this is a cost-effective USB tabletop mic that can cover about a range of 25 feet, and it has usually a 180-degree pickup pattern. So 180 degrees means that wherever that microphone's sitting at, it's almost like a fan all the way around it and all the way kind of around the front. What you can do with this microphone is that you can put this closer to the teacher at the front of the room, and then so those students who are attending remotely can hear what that teacher is teaching, but at the same time, you can again allow those students who are attending the remote to hear their fellow classmates who are in the classroom and any interactions that they may have, any questions that they may have, any comments that they may have on what is being taught. So it's going to give that remote student a little bit more sense of normal, I guess, if this is the new normal, but at least have that same experience that they would have in a classroom with all that spontaneous conversation. The next option that we have is in the center there, and that's the dual mic option. So typically what this offers a wireless wearable mic for the teacher that's usually an omnidirectional table mic for the students. So for instance, these are a Yamaha microphone right here. The one on the left is going to be a mic that the teacher can actually wear that's not going to impede, that they don't have to hold. They can still walk around and still have that flexibility of movement. And so those students who are attending remotely can still hear that teacher super clearly. But then the second mic is, again, to encourage those students who are on premise to speak up, excuse me, to speak up, to share their thoughts, to share their comments, to ask those questions, and those students who are attending remotely can hear all that and still feel a part of the group and still feel a part of the classroom. And then lastly, kind of speaking in that same vein, is the speakerphone option. And it's funny because we're seeing a ton of conference type of solutions that are typically used for like enterprise businesses in terms of like a conference room. Our educators are being super creative in terms of deploying these into a classroom setting. This kind of microphone is super popular because what it is again, it's a USB mic or Bluetooth speakerphone that can accommodate a wide range of room sizes, and then you can actually daisy chain two units together. They can be paired together via Bluetooth for even greater wireless flexibility. Otherwise, they can work connected via USB directly into the teacher's PC. But the main thing here is, again, you're allowing those remote students to hear those students on premise asking their questions and feel as if they're a part of the classroom and all that spontaneous conversation or thoughts or sharing of thoughts or meeting of minds, if you will. But what it does is it also minimizes the amount of times the students would have to touch that microphone, where you can see the one in the center. You can still have some sort of accidental transmission if one student who may have symptoms of COVID touches it, then hands it to the next student without having to, wipe it down between uses. Where this one, since it is a conference room, students don't have to physically touch the microphone, and those students who are attending remote can still hear them. There's a ton of options out there when it comes to microphones, so this is something to consider. Now, if you're looking to go more of the hybrid route, where this is more hybrid, but especially for those younger ones, and you're going to encourage your teachers to use some sort of mask or PPE. You're going to have students socially distanced in the classroom. We're going to go over some classroom amplification options that we have available to you. And there's a few different ones that you can go with. The first one on the left would be a ceiling-mounted microphone. So typically what these solutions would do is have some sort of pendant-style microphone that the teacher can wear around their neck. It's not going to inhibit their movement. They don't have to worry about holding it all day. I can imagine as a teacher holding a microphone all day would be exhausting, or you would have biceps of steel. But when it comes to using this, you can wear it around your neck. You can have the option of going the route of a ceiling-mounted microphone, like the ones that we're showing on the left here. It's going to have 4 evenly distributed speakers that allow that teacher's voice to carry clearly and be heard clearly throughout the room. The other 2 that we have in the center and up to the right are more of an all-in-one type of solution, where you're going to have the speaker, you're going to have that pendant microphone. Sometimes you have the capability of actually having student microphones as well. And what they do, again, is allowing that teacher who's wearing a mask to be heard clearly and effectively to students who are attending the classroom, especially if they're being socially distant. It's going to save a teacher on the strain on their voice from having to compensate for that muffled, the muffled voice they're going to have when wearing that mask. Oftentimes, the one in the center actually has lesson capture capabilities. So if a teacher is sharing a slide deck, you can actually record whatever he or she is sharing as well as their voice. And if you have a webcam tied to that computer, it can also record what they're showing too. So with these type of solutions, not only are you going to get classroom amplification for those students who are on premise, but then you can also connect it to a soft codec platform like Zoom, like WebEx or Google Hangouts Meet, and it can act as that microphone for those solutions as well for those students who are attending remote, so you'll have both bases covered. The one on the right, the one in the center is actually called the Front Row Juno, and then the one on the right is the Lightspeed Red Cat Access. It's an all-in-one audio system, again, comprised of a teacher-worn microphone and a flat panel speaker. So the speaker kind of looks like a LCD panel or a monitor, and the reason why it's flat is because it's going to give you clear, evenly distributed sound of just a teacher's voice. It's not really built for anything that's more deep like music or something of that nature. And then in that same vein, we're going to move into some of the options if you're going that hybrid route. You're going the route of having, some students on premise, even for, I feel like this covers especially the first 3 ones where it's that full on-site or that adjusted calendar or that hybrid route. You may want to start considering some sort of partition or divider in the classroom. And we're seeing a few different kinds of partitions. We're starting to see a lot of major school districts start request them. And there's a couple of different flavors, if you will. You can do one that is clamped onto the desk, like the one on the left. We see this deployed a lot, or we're seeing a lot of schools considering deploying these types of solutions in computer labs or areas where students are usually right next to each other, so that you can have that extra layer of protection against accidental transmission, whether a student is yelling, whether a student is coughing, sneezing, laughing, or I don't want to say crying, but you get my point. And then the other option we have that's going to give you a lot more flexibility is going to be a mobile room divider. We have there's a few options out there for those as well. Again, as the name implies, it's mobile. It's going to give you that flexibility to move it around the classroom. You can do, if you're going to go the route and you're considering perhaps converting an old cafeteria into a learning space, and we're going to get into that in a second. These are some of the options that you can deploy. And so speaking of that, I'm going to go on to this next slide and show you kind of this. So this is another option, and this is something that you can consider in terms of how you're going to reopen or include this into your reopening plans, is you can take the cafeteria, especially since the CDC is not recommending that you open these communal spaces, whether, cafeterias or gyms, to try to minimize the accidental transmission. We're seeing schools go the route of taking these open spaces, like Maureen had showed you earlier, I believe it was Hong Kong, that converted an auditorium into a learning space where students can socially distance fairly quickly. Because, as schools, you're tasked with a pretty impossible task, and that's how do you socially distance when you don't have the square footage. So this is one way to get super creative about that, is turning these communal, larger, traditionally non-classroom spaces into a learning space, and then using something like a mobile room divider, as you can see in the upper right, to separate students with some sort of desk where you can still have some sort of collaboration. Students can still see each other and communicate, but there is a layer of protection between them to help prevent that that accidental transmission of corona or COVID via yelling or screaming or sneezing or coughing. So these are kind of the strategies that we're seeing deployed. throughout school districts all over the nation, like I had mentioned earlier. I know that we had a ton of different things to really bring, but what we wanted to do is make this a lot more conversational. So at this point, we wanted to open it up to some questions and some, some next steps. Is there any ideas or any thoughts that you may have? Please feel free to share them with us so we can answer them now for you.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate that. And we did have a couple of questions. There's one in the Q&A and there's one in the chat. So please keep adding questions. One question in the Q&A is in regards to special ed students. And can you all share any information or maybe point us to some resources that can detail some of the considerations to be made for special ed students in a hybrid learning environment?
We actually have Ari, she's one of our education strategists, and she's been working really closely on those resources. So if Lindsay, you ping me later, I know she's put together some resources around that. That's specifically, I know, one of the things that she's been talking about. So I'd be happy to pass that along. I am, however, not an expert in that, but again, we can point you in the right direction.
Fantastic, I definitely will. Does anybody have any other questions for our panelists?
Yeah, I see there's a question here in terms of dividers that we have in stock. We definitely have some dividers in stock, like Mike had put into the Q&A. It all really depends on the kind of brand and model that you're looking for. One that I did not mention was we have access to dividers that are very similar to the ones that you saw in the China model, where you had the trifolds on top of a student desk, especially if you do not have the capability of freeing up any extra square footage. This could be a good solution to have, kind of help you in terms of still maintaining some sort of normalcy in your classroom. So have students in the classroom don't have that capability of socially distancing those students, or they're not capable to work remote. That would be a good option that you could do that's not going to have a huge footprint in your classroom.
There's another question in the chat in regards to resources for ENL students. I would assume that would also be for Ari.
Yeah, I can. I was going to say, I can share some info. Hopefully, I changed my audio source, so hopefully it's a little better now. Sorry for the issues earlier. But one of the things that we have seen with students who are learning different languages or are coming from a different background is some of the live translation features within the video conferencing solution that you may be using. So whether you're a Microsoft Teams school or a Google Meet school or a WebEx school, there are auto translation features available in some of those platforms. So that's something to take a look at. Certainly, as we've used some auto translation services, they're as good as they are in many cases. So it's not a surefire fix, but it is one option as far as leveraging this technology and providing that to the students who may need translation services.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mike, for that. And I promise you, I would have thought if I was someone just viewing this session that was a purposeful mishap that we had on Mike's audio there, but I promise you it wasn't.
I think there's a robust Fortnite tournament going on at my house right now, if I had to guess. So it's probably pulling down some bandwidth.
So we do have another question in the Q&A. We have, how might students in a hybrid model be practicing social distancing outside of the classrooms, for instance, in hallways and in recess?
I think that the taped guidelines on the floor are a big part of it. So when we're not in the classroom, similar to if anybody's gone into a store recently, there's markings of like 6 feet. There's a new article from NPR. They had, again, the tape guards on the floor just to, physically remind people, because it's so easy to forget and not know where to stand, but they actually had 6-foot boxes taped on a gym floor. So each individual student would know exactly where they were meant to be. Again, for recess, like depending on whether or not you're going to be using your playgrounds, A lot of schools are just closing them off entirely, and students are having to sort of play individually in their classrooms, which, is unfortunate. But, outside, I think it's a little bit harder, especially on grass or something where you're not able to mark it. But anywhere you can sort of mark and cohort students for recess is just another like visual reminder. The more we see, the more the students are going to sort of fall in line. My son is actually in daycare, and anecdotally, he'll like socially distance me sometimes when he's going to bed. Because he's learning, because it's being repeated to him over and over again, like, no, you can't come close to me, and he's 4. So reminding them with the tape and the guidance and messages and the teachers practicing it, I think is the best way to plan for that.
Yeah, constant communication as much as possible. Even gamifying it sometimes for the younger guys would work fantastic, as you see with Maureen and her son.
Are there any other questions for our panelists today? So we do have a question in the chat. Are PAL activities or partnering a no-go?
What was that?
Are PAL activities or partnering a no-go?
It's tough to, I think as Maureen and Santino were describing, I think physical education is going to look completely different. Even in that hybrid model, I know we've seen some of the, I'm sorry, I thought we were talking about physical activity. Thank you for the clarification. As far as collaboration and partnering, we've seen some innovative solutions within the classroom space that we were developing to support the 21st century classroom or modern learning environment that are actually can be utilized for that group work and partnering activity in a COVID situation as well, or social distance situation. Things like wireless screen sharing, for instance, where students will get into small groups. There may be a huddle space or a panel that they're sharing, or even collaborating within the classroom space themselves, and they can push that content that's on their screen onto another screen or another AV repository that will allow those students to collaborate. Even creating, if we're in a remote scenario as well, we can take within Zoom and WebEx and some of the other video conferencing tools and create breakout rooms and allow those students to still have that ability to break off into small groups and do some partnering together. Certainly other collaborative platforms such as Office 365 and Google Docs also allow that ability to partner or work on things simultaneously without physical interaction. So there are a couple of different ways of going about continuing to use collaboration there.
And I was going to add to that. I was going to say what Maureen mentioned earlier when it comes to cohorting. I feel like if you start getting into younger grades and you break them off into certain groups and cohort those groups, and just developing the partners within those groups might assist that. But if you wanted to get even further into that and in that conversation, please feel free to reach out to Lindsay, and we can schedule a call with one of our education strategists to speak more to how teachers can adjust for that shift.
Thanks, Santino. We do have a question in the chat that's specific to purchasing in New York City, and we'll send some information following the session today. Are there any other questions for our panelists?
Any questions on cameras? Be happy to help those out. Ideas. Or, you know what I'd love to see or hear? If there's anything that you are seeing that we did not cover. Because as much as anything, we learn a lot from educators such as yourselves out there. All of our thoughts is definitely on research and finding these solutions, but a lot of it does come too from having conversations with schools and trying to solve for specific challenges that they may have, and then being creative about that. So if there's anything that we did not mention that you're seeing, please share that with us right now, because that'd be fantastic. We'd love to have this be a sharing of thoughts.
Yeah, and while we wait for any comments there, one example of that is earlier in the slides, we're showing the tape markings on the floor. And you know, when we talk to customers about this, I was sharing this presentation with the school district a few weeks ago, and they said, you know, as important as it is to have those visual cue markers on the floor, we also need to make sure that we're putting them at eye level. They had envisioned this situation where students were going to be staring at their feet or at the floor the whole time, and then potentially crashing into each other because they weren't, you know, looking forward as well. So even just some of those basic concepts or simple ideas as far as making sure that we have signage on the floor for distancing and marking for the students to easily understand, but also at eye level, so they're not solely focused on the floor. Some of those basic ideas that can also help out schools and just planning as far as that return to school.
Thanks, Mike. Any ideas from the audience? Anything that we haven't covered? Any questions that you might have for these experts?
I guess we did our job effectively.
I do see a new one in the Q&A. So the question is, we are a very low-tech school and students are not allowed to use computers, so everything is from the top down. Recommendations for cameras and microphones in a hybrid ran by dinosaurs.
I would say, and Mike, feel free to jump in too as well. Personally, if it's not recommended, if it's not dinosaurs, I would possibly, and Maureen, if you want to go back to the 4 strategies, I would possibly say that the cart model would be the most effective. The reason being is because then you don't have to worry too much in terms of if you're going to have students who are attending remote, and if your students don't have, I'm assuming this is, if for a remote model, it's going to be difficult for those students to log in and work with, work with your teachers if they're socially distant. Or they're working remote and communicating with them remote. But if your school does not like to invest too heavily into technology, I would say the CART model is probably the most flexible one for you, because then you don't have to worry about getting one for each classroom, but you can have one and you can share it across several different classrooms as needed. So the other route you can go, I mean, if you're going to be encouraged to be 100% on site, then I wouldn't even worry about a camera. I would just go the route of classroom amplification. It's something to, because I'm assuming that your school district is going to encourage some sort of PPE device being worn, like a mask, and the students being separated out if they can. I would go the route of a classroom amplification microphone, just so that everything that teacher is teaching is being heard clearly and effectively, that students are grasping everything that's being taught. That's the route I would go. If your students do have access to technology at home, just not at school, and you are going to be working remote, we see a lot of school districts go the route of basically of like kind of flipping the classroom, where a teacher will record something and then share out a link later for those students to access it when they have the capability to do so, may be effective as well. But I would probably say if you're looking for cameras and you're very low tech and the school's ran by dinosaurs, I would say go the route of the cart, because then you have the flexibility of moving it from classroom to classroom as needed, since not all of the instruction is going to be online. Mike, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I would concur. Especially if we're talking K-12 education, budgets are always a concern as well. That first and foremost piece, especially if we're talking about remote learning, is really understanding, or hybrid as well, is making sure that you have a solid video conferencing platform. From there, you can really build off of that. So you can add a better camera, you can add better audio. Much like we experienced here today with myself, where I was using a new microphone and failed to test it, make sure that you're testing out those solutions as you're implementing them to make sure that your audience on the other side can effectively participate and understand and hear and see what you are hoping to demonstrate. And there are a lot of ways to leverage other pieces of technology that you may have as well. Things like document cameras, for instance. Maybe you're used to using that document camera in conjunction with a projector in your classroom on a day-to-day basis. You can plug that into your computer and share that as a video source within your video conferencing platform and use it as an ad hoc video camera, or even bring that information, that analog information that's in the classroom, to the students who are on the other side of the digital wall, as it were, who are at home. So, you know, as we think about remote and hybrid, we're really talking about that video conferencing platform, the video quality and the audio quality. But those, you know, if it's too difficult to use, or you can't get a clear picture or an effective audio signal, then it's really not a good solution at the end of the day. So, you know, think basic, and we can always refine it as we go along based on the comfort level of the end user, the availability of budget, and the availability of product as well.
Yeah, and I would say, and I saw the addenda to that question. I would definitely say the card model then, because then you're going to have that screen so that the students who are sitting in that classroom are able to see that teacher's face a lot larger, as opposed to just being like on the 13-inch, well, they're not going to have computers, but you can have that wheeled in, like, I'm going to date myself here, but like you would wheel in a DVD player on a TV cart. You can wheel that teacher in on the cart, have them in the classroom. Students could be in that classroom, and they could still follow along with everything that teacher is teaching remotely. If the teacher has a device, obviously they can use the webcam that's going to be in that laptop if they have a desktop. But if they do not have a device, or they're not using their own laptop, then you may have to look at something like a webcam. I would recommend getting a higher quality webcam, just because it's going to be able to see them more clearly and effectively, and it's not going to be blurry, especially if you get it on a 50 to 55-inch monitor. But that's the area that we're seeing the most constraint in when it comes to stock. So that's just one thing to take into consideration. I see another question. Is there anything to increase bandwidth or the power of the internet? Lots of glitching occurs. Unfortunately, no. Maybe audio. Mike, would you say that would probably be?
Yeah, I mean, as far as increasing bandwidth, at the end of the day, if you're at your home, if you're at school, there are some optimizations you can make within that video conferencing platform. But a lot of that has to do with the bandwidth that you're using or receiving from your internet service provider, either at home or at school. So some effective ways of helping with that are, you can have, when video is not required, say you're showing a PowerPoint and you don't need video, you can encourage your students and yourself to turn your video off, and that will help decrease the bandwidth that's needed for that video conference. You can prioritize those items. If you have a shared PowerPoint or Google slide or document, you can send out that link so those individuals can pull down that information on their own internet, as opposed to having it also shared via the video conferencing solution. So there are some ways of trying to use some of those collaborative techniques in addition to the video conferencing platform if you are suffering from choppy internet or limited bandwidth.
Fantastic.
Yes, high five DVD. Giving you a virtual high five.
That was a great reference there, Santino. I appreciated it too. All right, if there are no other questions, I want to say thank you so much to our friends at CDW, to Mike, Santino, Maureen, and Cale. Thanks so much for all the information that you shared with us today. Thank you to all of our attendees for attending another Tech Virtual Summit session. We will be sharing out all of the information, the slides that you saw today. So look for that in an email. And as always, you can connect with us at Tech and on our PD platform, Otis. If you have any questions, feel free to follow up. Thanks, everyone. Take care and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye, Lindsay.